I'll start by talking just very briefly about what DFAT did and examined. DFAT, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. We played essentially 5 roles. The policy leadership role in Canberra, described earlier. We did a lot of work organising the international coalition around the world. We maintained an embassy in Kabul from 2006 onwards. We led the provincial reconstruction team. And finally, we had political officers like myself working there in Uruzgan province, and that's going to be my focus today, since that's what I was doing, what I know about. Backtracking a bit, where is Uruzgan? Tiny province in the south of Afghanistan, Pashtun country, 5% literacy, subsistence agriculture, and relatively low-key in the Afghan history, except that it was the launching pad for Karzai's rise to power. He and a dozen Navy SEALs took over the Uruzgan provincial government compound in about November of 2001. The Taliban sent a convoy up from Kandahar to kick them out. The convoy was destroyed by American special forces and airstrikes. The Taliban realised at that point they couldn't win and left Kandahar. Karzai swept down to Kandahar with this group and became president of Afghanistan. So it's not inconsequential in Afghan history, this province of Uruzgan. Then comes this period of 2002 to 2005. The Taliban, by 2002, was disgraced and defeated by the overwhelming shock and awe of special forces and air power. And yet, by 2005, they were resurgent. Well, I wasn't there, I couldn't tell you why that happened. Bill Maley might have a better idea. But from what I've read from various books, it's a combination of factors. Firstly, the intervention in Iraq got us preoccupied. At the time, we said we don't do nation building, but of course, if you don't do nation building, you leave a power vacuum, and that leaves room for either the warlords or the Taliban. Thirdly, it seems that government was commandeered by the warlords, which made the warlords' enemies resentful of government and gave them reason to join the Taliban. And then it might be the case that we failed to offer the Taliban a place at the table in the political spectrum. And so they naturally went and grew because they didn't have any access to power or control. And that's the previous story is a story of the power of special forces and air. The latter story is a story of the limitations of air and special forces. And so it was that in 2005, international community was called on to send troops, and 50-nation coalition built up, and different countries took on different provinces as part of a sensible enough international division of labour. The Brits went to Helmand, Canadians to Kandahar, Germans to Kunduz, Kiwis to Bamiyan, and the Dutch agreed to take on Uruzgan province on the condition they have a First Nation partner. And as described earlier, we became that partner, initially sending special forces in the middle of 2005 and subsequently a reconstruction task force. Engineers focused on building schools, teaching Afghan boys trade skills, hospitals, roads, things like that. So, Uruzgan province, one of 34 provinces. How did it become our province? Well, it's a combination of historical accidents described earlier, coalition alliance considerations, political considerations, but once our military went into Uruzgan province, it became our province. The equity, the political, emotional equity followed the military. We started to care about it. And so initially, the province was, as I said, a Dutch lead. We were a support contingent. We had our special forces. We had an RTF, Reconstruction Task Force, then an MRTF, a Mentoring and Reconstruction Task Force, then a Mentoring Task Force. We were operating there alongside US Special Forces contingent, been there since 2002, and some elements from Slovakia and Singapore. But it was a Dutch-led base. The Netherlands had a strong military contingent, 2,000 soldiers, a provincial reconstruction team that in the course of its work pumped €50 million of development into the province. And they had what they called a 3D approach: development, diplomacy, and defence, which was eventually the counterinsurgency approach that was adapted in 2009. Very comprehensive. Australian diplomats did not start working in southern Afghanistan until July 2009. Why were we sent in? Well, as Dad mentioned earlier, we wanted to do and be seen to do what others were doing. And at the time, the ISAF strategy shifted from a kinetic approach targeting the enemy to counterinsurgency, protecting the population from the enemy and winning the population over to the government. And so countries started to send diplomats in. And because they were, we did. But it's not a bad idea altogether. Firstly, because the one thing we know about these situations, these stabilisation operations, is if you don't get the politics right, no amount of military force will work. You need to understand and manage the politics, so diplomats are needed. But also, government needs an independent source of advice, which is another good reason to send diplomats in these situations. So I showed up there in late 2009. Now, I have a view that people with different specialisations within government tend to show up in these places and do whatever they're good at. For all you've got to hammer, what you tend to see is a nail. If you send a bunch of engineers, they're going to ask, where do you want the bridge built? If you send some special forces, they go, okay, where's the list? If you send diplomats, our first question is, who wants a drink? Or in the Islamic world, who wants a cup of tea? And it's not because we're alcoholics or particularly like tea, it's because the conversations matter. And we don't have conversations just because we're chatty, we have conversations firstly in order to comprehend, and secondly, to influence, in that order. So when I showed up there, the first thing I did was just have as many conversations as I could with as many people as I could. Afghans, Americans, but also the Dutch who were leading the base. Now the Dutch had invested a great deal in cultural knowledge and speciality. Expatriate Afghans who went to Holland in the Taliban years were put into uniform and sent to Uruzgan to work with them. And they had cultural advisors, some Afghan, but also a Dutchman by the name of Willem Vogelsang, who went, he was a hippie really, he went out to Afghanistan in 1984 and kicked around with the Mujahideen and was now working as a museum curator and was commandeered as a cultural advisor. And he had sort of a mop of silver hair, cut 64 Beatles style, socks and sandals. The Dutch soldiers referred to him as Geitenwolle Sokkendrager, which is Dutch for wearer of goat hair socks. I spoke to him at great length to try and understand the environment I was in, and he said to me, and I wrote these notes down, he said, land ownership has forever been contested but was further unsettled by the coming and going regimes over the last 3 decades, each with their own legal systems. Localised competition for land and water is a bigger influence on Uruzgan dynamics than the struggle with the Taliban. Interesting. People are very focused on daily survival. They will always be asking themselves, who do I cooperate with to survive, the government or the Taliban? He said no one wants the Taliban back, but Afghans need to feel they'll be protected by the government. Part of this job is making the government more trustworthy, but this is difficult because many government officials are poorly trained and corrupt. And finally, he said, we can't play God, but we can understand our role in the ecosystem. In this competitive environment, we are seen as a source of power and resources. We can either decide how to allocate those in support of goals or have it decided for us. In any case, we need to be aware so as not to be manipulated. So that's interesting. We go to a place like this thinking we're there to pursue the enemy, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, whatever it might be. But through localised, we're a source of power and resources in their contest with one another. And that's shaping what's going on. Now, why does this matter? It goes beyond the traditional red team, blue team, goodies, baddies paradigm. Well, it relates to the good guys and the bad guys because, as not to diminish here the role of the forces, the special forces made it very hard for the Taliban in Afghanistan. Our regular forces did a great job in holding ground. The security approach is necessary, but equally important is to understand that the Taliban cannot operate in these areas unless they have local support. So the question is, why do the local nationals make the choices they make? And understanding that is always going to be critical to keeping things on the rails in a place like this. So there it is, Uruzgan 101, basics, competitive survivalist culture in which we're seen as a source of power and resources. So, what does this mean? Well, in terms of the first job of a diplomat, to comprehend, it means you need to filter, synthesize, and triangulate. Okay, there's no data, there's no census going on here. The only thing you know is what people tell you. But of course, what one tribal leader tells you may be different from what another tells you. In fact, I spent most of my time talking to tribal leaders, most of whom came in to complain about other tribal leaders. So how do you get a sense of reality? Well, you triangulate. The truth might be somewhere in between, but the key thing is to talk to everyone, because if you're talking to just one side, you'll be blind to the other side. In terms of influence, it means that every decision you make about the allocation of military resources or financial resources is going to benefit someone, probably in their eyes at least, at the expense of someone else. So every decision is political. Tricky business. So how do you navigate this? Well, you need what we call a political strategy. And the evolution of the ISAF political strategy in Uruzgan was a little haphazard in that period, 2006, 2010. You see, we were at the time focused on mentoring the Afghan army, and we were innocent of all these tribal politics. The US Special Forces who were operating the base had been there since 2002, and at the time, the Popolzai warlord Jan Muhammad Khan had been appointed as governor of Uruzgan, so it was natural for the American Special Forces at the time to work with JMK. We even reduced the Afghans to acronyms, and subsequently with his henchman MK Matullah Khan. So they're from the Popolzai sub-tribe of Pashtuns concentrated around Tarin Kowt. So then the Dutch show up in 2006 and they discover that security in the province is not good. You can't go out into the Mirabad Valley to the east without getting shot at. You can't get up into the Baluchi and Chora without getting shot at by Taliban. And the Dutch do an odd thing. They conduct some research. And the research reveals that the reasons why the tribes in those valleys are supporting the Taliban is because they are afraid of the governor. And therefore the special forces, who may or may not be getting their information from the governor as to who the enemy is. And so who do those tribes turn to but the local sales representative from the Taliban for protection? It makes sense. People do things for logical reasons in Afghanistan when they're trying to survive. So the Dutch evolved their own tribal policy, their own political strategy, which was to firstly eschew all contact with the Popolzai warlords and to build close relationships with the tribesmen from the other tribes, the Baraksai and the Mirabad, the Gilzai and the Mirabad, Akchiksai, Baraksai and Chora and the Baluchi, and the Nurzai concentrated out to Durawood. And they built those relationships, and on the back of those relationships, punched out into those valleys with the help of Australian forces and the Afghan army. That was the Dutch policy. So what you had here was two conflicting political strategies, the American one and the Dutch one, coexisting, which is pretty untidy, except that it enabled us to do a very Afghan thing, which was to play both sides. Beautiful. Okay, so I'm going to talk briefly about the influence of home domestic politics on these missions. Now, in Australia, we were lucky we had bipartisan support. That shaped the nature of the mission, the size and scope of it to some extent. But on the ground, I would say that we had a fair bit of autonomy and were mostly left alone. In contrast, the Dutch mission in Afghanistan, in Uruzgan, was very contentious. 3 of the 6 major Dutch political parties were supportive, 3 were against. And that meant, it shaped the mission for better and worse. It meant that it had to be, as well as being a military mission, it had to be a development mission. It meant some of their development projects were known as eye-catching deliverables, like the Tarin Kowt International Airport. It would photograph well and look good on a brochure in The Hague. It meant that they eschewed all contact with the Popolzai warlords because it would be distasteful in Dutch politics to deal with them, apart from logical reasons for not talking to them. And it also made for uncertainty over the Dutch mission. Their mandate was due to expire in 2010. Whenever you asked the Dutch diplomats what would happen after 2010, they would give you the official line, which was 2011. They didn't know. The Dutch cabinet met in February 2010 to discuss the Uruzgan issue. It met 17 times, decided they couldn't decide, dissolved the coalition, called an election. It brought down a Dutch government. And the default setting was that the Dutch would leave, and that left Australia with the choice described earlier. What to do now? Would we take over the CTU? And for various reasons, we did not take over this combined team Uruzgan, the new formation with the Americans, but we did agree to lead the provincial reconstruction team, an international mission team focused on development and diplomacy. So 2 different structures operating within that area, with the CTU and separate, equal and cooperative with us, the PRT, led by a DFAT 2-star equivalent. So the Provincial Reconstruction Team, military heavy, but based around a civilian payload, basically. Political advisors, development advisors, stabilisation advisors from the ACC, including David Savage. an ops team, combined Aus-US, and we were given the benefit of a 50-soldier OGA platoon, Australian soldiers and a bunch of Bushmasters dedicated to getting us around and protecting us. We could not have operated without them, and it was an important innovation. I don't think anything like this being done before, quite a new thing. Plus some American civil affairs officers and some ADF engineers and cultural and linguistic advisors, some of whom we inherited from the Dutch. And we got the best interpreters on the base and up their pay scale so that we could keep them. And that was critical because you're engaging with Afghans who needed to be treated with respect and clarity. So getting back to the tribal and political stuff, the Dutch withdrawal created a lot of anxiety around the province amongst Barakzai, Gilzai tribesmen who thought, well, if the US takes over again, we're back to the bad old days of JMK dominating as governor. And so in March, April that year, we had to send a clear signal about what the political strategy would be. And so we sat down and we thought a great deal about it. And for all the reasons I described, I thought a balanced approach. I thought we needed to engage the tribes. But I talked to Colonel Jason Blaine about it and said, what do you think about this tribal strategy? Should we back MK or should we continue to engage the other tribes? And he said, well, my boys are out in the Mirabad, my boys are up in Chora. We need to have relationships with those tribes. It's straightforward. We go tribal balance and we engage Machula. So we had a three-pronged strategy, which was firstly to build relationships with the senior warlord in town. He had a militia of 3,000 men, a semi-official status in the police. We could not talk to him. So we engaged with him and did what we could to try and turn him into more of a statesman and less of a warlord. Meanwhile, we continued to engage those other tribes, built relationships with them, continued to support them with funding and projects. And we did whatever we could to reinforce and support the provincial government in building its resilience, its capacity, its resources, and all those things as part of the general counterinsurgency strategy. Okay, so that's the big picture of what was going on from the TK angle. We're looking at different levels of big picture. You got a very big picture earlier on. This is Tarin Kowt, provincial capital. But you need to look even finer in Afghanistan because it's a highly decentralized country. You can't just deal with the capital, Kabul, and think you've got a solution. You can't even deal with the provincial capital and think you've got a solution. You need to get down to the districts. And I worked for 2 months as a political officer at Forward Operating Base Mirwais in July, August, September of 2010. And I'm going to give you a view from the districts. I'm going to start with a story, the purpose of which is to demonstrate how localized security was in an environment like this. So I was sent up there with a team of a dozen American shooters whose job was to surround me as we went out on visits, and they would be there with the glare foils and the M4s pointing outwards, surrounding me, and I'd walk in the middle, waving like Ronald McDonald. Those boys got a bit bored of that after a while and wanted some action, so one day the police mentors, the American police mentors, asked to borrow 5 of them. I said, okay, take 5. And they went down south of the Chora district centre to a place called Kala Kala. And they arrived there and they talked to an Afghan man who said, yeah, no, it's quiet around here, security's great. Malam Sadiq, local tribal leader, and his militia of about 40 guys, they look after things, it's cool. And then the Afghan man said, but if you go 100 metres that way and cross that aqueduct, you'll get shot at. So what did the boys do? They went 100 metres that way, crossed the aqueduct, great big contact. Fortunately, they survived. It was an ambush. They got shot at from about 100, 200 metres. And they got back safely, thankfully. But what it demonstrates is just how localised security is. And the conclusion we came to up in that Chora district is that security in any given suburb, let's call it a suburb of Afghanistan, is largely a function of the strength of the local leader and the amount of harmony or otherwise in that little village or area. The Taliban operates by either targeting local leaders, by exploiting local divisions, finding points of weakness at the very local community level, by intimidation, letters under the door, putting a couple of people in a village with a weapon that can threaten people, by IEDs, improvised explosive devices to impair our mobility, and by propaganda. For example, In the lead up to September 11th, 2010, a priest in Gainesville, Florida decided to hold his own international Burn the Quran Day. This created inconvenience for us. An event we know now as the Chora Rock Show. 1,000 Afghans converged on the base and started throwing rocks. Well, our tactics at the military level were to disrupt the Taliban mainly, finding huge weapons caches, intelligence-led patrols that brought all sorts of stuff out of the woodwork, from AP mines to 303s to RPGs to Russian anti-tank mines. And of course, we were developing the ANA on the ground there to improve their capacity, always patrolling with the ANA. But from the point of view of a political officer, what were we doing? Well, we were supporting the local leaders because we knew their resilience and their strength mattered for security. And we supported the district chief, Muhammad Dawood Khan, taking him out to the villages, being seen to support him. But look, there were others aligned against MDK, sponsored by Matullah Khan from Kabul, from TK, including Thin Sadiq and one known as Fat Sadiq. They would undermine him actively, as did the provincial governor at the time, as did the chief of police at the time. The tribal politics run deep. So that was 2010, and I came back from the FOB and worked a little longer in TK, then came back to Australia. And then there were these middle years that I wasn't in Afghanistan for, 2011, 2012, and we made a certain amount of progress in that time. The provincial reconstruction team got to critical mass, got operational, got some money under us, started working effectively. We had a good governor, Omar Sherzad, and we managed to increase the strength of the provincial government. When we arrived, it had 25% of its staffing roster filled. When we left, it had 75% of its staffing roster filled. It had 24 line departments, regular meetings. It functioned more like a provincial government. There were setbacks in that time. Green on blue incidents, of course, that were shocking to us all. The district chief from Chora, my mate MDK, was assassinated, as was Jan Muhammad Khan, in mysterious circumstances. The outcome of this was that JMK's henchman, Matullah Khan, the new warlord, the main warlord on the block, was appointed chief of police. Now, this was an ambiguous thing for many Uruzganis. Those who feared him from those other tribes thought this was the beginning of the end. On the other hand, many saw him as a great benefactor and protector. In any case, he'd been appointed by Karzai, we had to work with him, and we continued our policy of trying to turn him into more of a statesman, more inclusive, less of a warlord. And eventually he became seen as a security provider, even in some of the valleys that where he'd formerly been feared. He spread a network of checkpoints out into those valleys, which became quite essential to security. And on the back of that security, more development could get done, which is what the Afghans in the valleys wanted. There were achievements in this era. We managed to finish the Dutch Road to Chora project by building relationships with previously hostile tribal elements in the Baluchi Valley, getting them involved in the project. We punched a bitumen road all the way to Chora, and the Afghans love a bitumen road. The Malalai Girls' School in Tarin Kowt, which eventually had 700 female students in it. The Mirabad Valley, which had been Taliban dominated in 2009, by 2013 was coalition country, and the people out there were happy with us. I went back to Afghanistan in 2013 for the last 6 months of the mission, in part to see how it would end. By that point, our soldiers had come in from the forward operating bases. Afghan security forces were out at the checkpoints in the valleys, and we were watching as the summer began to see whether those checkpoints would hold. Meanwhile, on the base in Tarin Kowt, we were focused on retrograde, which was about shrinking the base and getting out, a massive exercise. Not quite on the scale of Dunkirk, but it was logistical, tricky. I was focused on preserving the airfield and getting it running post our departure. Why? Because without the airfield, you couldn't sustain the Afghan National Army, and all that we'd done to mentor them would have been in vain. So I was very focused on getting all the logistical and Ministry of Transport, fuel, aviation fuel, all those elements together to keep the airfield going. October came, and it came time for ceremonies to mark the departure, including one in Tarin Kowt on the 28th of October, where both the opposition leader and the Prime Minister spoke, and presented at the transfer of authority ceremony. And the other thing I did in that period was conduct some interviews. You see, we'd never conducted a baseline survey to see where things were at when we arrived in 2006. Mullum Habibullah on the broader ISAF agenda said we'd achieve roads, 5 things: education, government, security, and the basic elements of a modern economy. He said these were all big achievements after 40 years. He said the mistakes we'd made were civilian casualty incidents, airstrikes gone wrong, and situations where the wrong people had attacked based on bad intelligence. Current situations, well, we've gone down from 130,000 troops in Afghanistan, foreign troops, to 16,000. Some people expected a collapse then. The situation is better than expected, but the Taliban is still resistant, resilient, and holds more territory than it has since 2001, including some parts of Uruzgan province. It's still insecure, the politics is still complicated, the ANSF is holding provincial capitals, Uruzgan is under a certain amount of pressure, but more or less they're bumbling through. So how do we do? Well, on the warlord management front, we didn't do too badly. We influenced Machula constructively while maintaining relationships that the Dutch had built, but in the end, of course, he died. You live by the sword, you die by the sword. Machula was killed in 2015, and that creates a vacuum. And so I suppose one lesson is invest in institutions, not individuals. Of course, the Afghan problem is institutions are not strong, big men are. But you've got to work around that. It's a big man culture that those of you who work in the Pacific would be familiar with. So in conclusion, well, in terms of the broader strategy, the key strategic objective was to support the US alliance. We could have achieved that if we'd shown up and played cards. But that's not what we did. Australian soldiers, Australian bureaucrats don't do that. We got out there and we tried to make a difference. And we did make a difference while we were there. We managed the politics pretty well, but in the end, the long-term success in Uruzgan was really contingent on the broader success in Afghanistan, and that was a sense beyond our control. If you want to hear a version of all this sung, you can get my CD. Kids love this stuff. It's full of songs about war and death. But if you want something more cerebral for your father, get my book. Or if you want to make your dad really happy, get the combination pack. I'll be signing both outside.